interesting to have those goals conflict. Zuko wants to be loved and accepted by his family, but he also wants to regain his honor. These two things do not necessarily coincide. Of course, antagonists who are motivated to do anything for their goal are exceptionally dangerous. Reflection. It is critical to understand the antagonist's motives within the context of the protagonist's. One way to do this is to reflect the protagonist's motives. John Truby writes in The Anatomy of Story that you must see the opponent structurally, in terms of his function in the story. A true opponent not only wants to prevent the hero from achieving his desire, but is competing with the hero for the same goal. Find the deepest level of conflict between them. Ask yourself, what is the most important thing they are fighting about? Underpinning this is one question: which motive will best bring the antagonist into conflict with the protagonist? In Alan Moore's The Killing Joke, the Joker and Batman are not simply fighting over the fate of Jim Gordon. The Joker wants to prove that ordinary people are just like him if they have one bad day, whereas Batman believes they can still choose to be good. They are brought into conflict because the antagonist's motivation fundamentally reflects, but disagrees, with the protagonist's motivation, naturally bringing them into a conflict where only one of them can come out on top, and be proved correct. A second method is to share the protagonist's motives in a way that brings them into conflict. In The Godfather, while there was a pretense of the conflict arising around disagreements on whether the New York crime families should peddle heroin, the actions of the Tartaglia and Barzini crime families were clearly motivated by values of family, loyalty, and a sense of vengeful justice. As opposed to The Killing Joke, these values are shared by the antagonists and protagonists, and it is because they share them that there is a cycle of vengeance and violence that fuels the conflict of the story. If the values that underpin the antagonist's motivation wouldn't naturally bring them into conflict with the protagonist, then it can seem a weak justification for their involvement in the story. A story is not going to function as cohesively if the antagonists are motivated by greed, and the protagonist does not care if others are greedy or are greedy themselves. No natural relationship of conflict arises, and either party could be replaced by almost anyone else. Either having such different motives that it creates conflict or such similar motives that it creates conflict can be an effective way to ensure the momentum of the story is firmly grounded in that relationship between the motives of the protagonist and the antagonist. Passive versus active characters. The motivation of the antagonist will exist somewhere on the scale between passive motivation and active motivation. The former is acting to stop the hero from achieving their goal, while the latter is the antagonist wanting to achieve their personal goal, and defeating the hero may be required for this. One example of passive motivation is the character Bertha Mason in Bronte's Jane Eyre, whose motivation is primarily to stop the hero achieving her goal of marrying Edward Rochester. If Jane Eyre did not have a goal, and was not acting to reach it, then Bertha Mason would not be doing anything. However, if Bertha Mason was not there, Jane Eyre would still be trying to achieve her goal, just without the obstacle of Bertha. This passivity of the antagonist often makes the hero more interesting, because it gives them more agency in the narrative. They decide the direction of the story, and the antagonist responds to them. Do not take this as an absolute rule. There are plenty of examples of fascinating passive characters. The classic fairytale of Snow White is an extreme example of active motivation. The queen's motivation to become the fairest in the land leads her to take down Snow White in hopes of achieving her goal. This active role she plays, being motivated towards her own goal, makes her more imposing as an antagonist because the story is based around her actions forcing the heroes to act. It is her decision to send out the huntsman, to offer the laced bodices, to give Snow White a poisoned comb, and to give her the poisoned apple that guides the tension of the story. In contrast, Snow White does not even really have a goal, and takes no action that changes the direction of the story. To be clear, this is a continuum, and most antagonists sit somewhere in the middle between these two extremes. For example, take Moriarty in the BBC's Sherlock series. He wants to stop Sherlock from achieving his goal of undermining his criminal empire, making him passive, but Moriarty also has a goal to personally destroy Sherlock, making him active. Deciding whether your antagonist has a more passive or more active motivation will help determine how your protagonist and antagonist are brought into conflict. While there is a tendency for more passive antagonists to give heroes agency in the story, and active antagonists to be a more threatening force, there are plenty of exceptions to this, and you should not let this alone dictate how you design your antagonist's motivation. Good guide villains. There is a lot of writing advice out there that simply is not that great, and we will discuss one piece of it here. The most compelling antagonist is the one who believes they are the good guy. This is not entirely true. This idea rose to prominence with the recent trend beginning with the grittier comics of the 80s and 90s, riding a wave of popularity through to the rise of darker fantasy like Mark Lawrence's Prince of Thorns, and now in what we see in the deconstructive realism of Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. That is to set aside the binary morality of good heroes and evil villains in favor of a grey morality that makes the audience respect or even agree with the antagonist. From this comes the assertion that the antagonist must believe they are the good guy. And there is nothing wrong with having such an antagonist. It can create incredibly compelling characters like John Milton does in Paradise Lost, where he makes Lucifer a sympathetic antagonist. In Alan Moore's graphic novel Watchmen, readers can relate to Ozymandias' disillusion with authority and anger at how humans fight one another, an experience that motivates him to take action. The reason of a good guy antagonist motivation works is that it creates a more relatable character, which can give the impression of complexity and depth, given how egotistical humanity is and that we all assume we are incredibly deep and thoughtful. This is not only because that complexity often arises out of them taking a particular moral position on a nuanced topic society is still discussing, but because that complex moral motivation can easily be tied to human experiences, love, greed, fear, or anything else. Tension. Good guy antagonists can also heighten tension throughout the story in a way others cannot. Tangentially related, if opposite, to this sentiment is the phrase, the best antagonist is the one that makes readers cheer when they see them defeated. Once again, any universal statement like this is almost always either entirely incorrect or so broad as to be wholly useless. In Michael Hirst's Vikings, King Egbert and King Ragnar are each other's antagonists. However, the audience grows to understand, sympathize with, and love Egbert to the point that they want neither Ragnar nor Egbert to lose their respective battles. This creates an interesting form of tension. Good guy antagonists allow the writer to create a point of tension where the reader wants neither the antagonistic or protagonistic forces to be defeated, giving the story a distinctly tragic undertone, one that Vikings masters. Such a tone or tense setup simply cannot be achieved with the make readers cheer when they are defeated type of villain. Theme. Good guy antagonists also allow the author to more easily use their motivation to further develop a theme. To continue with the Watchmen example, Dr. Manhattan's decision to kill someone, motivated by a desire to prevent the world returning the chaos, helps the reader question the inherent value of truth, justice, or the concept of the hero. Theme is primarily explored through how the hero confronts certain challenges in the story, but this exploration is often subtle and written between the lines, per se. In Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, Javert's motivation of an absolutist morality of law, order, truth, and justice presents a sharp contrast to Jean Valjean's belief in redemption and separating law from morality, to the extent Hugo used their struggle as a conduit and proxy for the theme. A morally grey antagonist motivation allows the author to explore theme in a way evil antagonists cannot. It more easily allows for a comprehensive discussion between multiple viewpoints, creating a multidimensional protagonist-antagonist relationship that is not simply physical, but ideological. However, one danger here is taking this too far, and having the theme feel heavy-handed for the reader. This often happens where the conflict is so clearly allegorical, or the interactions between antagonist and hero are so ideologically charged that they lack any real character arc or character experience to truly give them context. They come across more like mouthpieces for the author. However, none of this means that the antagonist must believe they are the good guy. People often do things that they know should not, sometimes out of fear or addiction, and it is common for people to believe that what they do is not necessarily morally righteous, but that it is just not morally wrong. A great example of this is Tywin Lannister from G.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series. As leader of House Lannister, Tywin orchestrated the mass murder of the Rains of Castamere, along with 300 men, women, and children. But Tywin never viewed himself as either good or evil. He was motivated by duty, the survival of his house, and honor. He saw himself as a consistent, effective, and respected leader, but reducing that to him being the good guy would be overly simplistic for his character. There are also some few people out there who genuinely do not care if an action is wrong, or they do not believe in such things as right and wrong, for example, Hannibal Lecter in Thomas Harris' Silence of the Lambs. These are each fantastic and compelling characters that don't believe they are the good guys. Forcing an antagonist to see themselves as a good or evil restricts how they can think about themselves as people and limits their motivation to this binary morality, when in fact, motivation is far more complex. This, in turn, undermines any themes associated with their motivation, because very few thematic ideas can ever be reduced to conceptions of what is a good and evil. Save the world stories. Before we go any further, let us consider Tony Stark's weekend plans, saving the world. The antagonist's end goal is intimately connected to their motivation, and the magnitude of the antagonist's goal necessarily impacts how the tension in the narrative is built. Antagonists can have plans that range from murdering a Cockney chicken with a proclivity for knitting to obliterating all life in not just this universe, but every universe or reality. One factor in building tension that most authors will already know is raising the stakes of the story, these being what could be lost should the protagonists fail. Throughout the story, the stakes continually rise until the climactic point, often described as the do-or-die moment, where it feels like one wrong step could lose the hero everything. In Stephen King's Under the Dome, Barbie and Julia's pleading with the aliens to let the few dozen remaining people survive is one such moment. At no point in the story previously was more at stake for our main characters. And it is here that an issue arises from Save the World stories where the antagonist wants to destroy, take over, or otherwise radically change the world in such a way that it would be apocalyptic. The tension in the do-or-die moment relies on the reader's ability to believe that whatever is at stake can be lost, but it is incredibly difficult to convince a reader that the world could be taken over or destroyed. We have been conditioned by a never-ending barrage of happily ever after stories that even if individual characters might die, the world will live on, and the heroes will win. This fantasy is evidence of the self-indulgent nature of writing. But what this means is that deriving the tension solely from that possible destruction of everything the reader has come to know in your story weakens any suspense for the reader, they simply will not believe it. Because of this, it can be effective to derive the tension in the story less from the fate of the world and more from the fate of the characters and things involved. One great example of this is the Doctor Who episode The Waters of Mars. The fate of the world is at stake with the characters attempting to stop a terrifying virus reaching Earth, but that point of tension in the story is treated as secondary to the tension surrounding whether the Doctor can or should get everyone out alive. At the same time, a lot of tension builds around who will die as the virus kills the characters off one by one. The writers build suspense in this Save the World story in a few ways. 1. The protagonists spend far more time concerned with whether they or their friends will die than with whether the antagonist is getting closer to their goal of destroying the world. 2. Even though the danger the antagonist poses is on a worldwide scale, its threat is primarily established by the threat it poses to individual people. If the reader never sees the lives of real people at stake throughout the story, they are less likely to believe that they can be at stake during the climax. 3. The obstacles the Doctor faces during the climax are not integral to stopping the virus reaching Earth, but they are integral to stopping the virus killing people. They actually establish very early on that, should they truly need to, the protagonists can blow up the base to kill the virus at the cost of stranding themselves. Where your antagonist's motivation and end goal involve the destruction of the world as we know it, deriving the tension from the fate of characters or things involved can be an effective way to maintain tension. It also helps with immersion, because readers are typically attached to characters more so than a world or vague population, something they cannot relate to personally. Summary. 1. Firstly, showing the values behind the antagonist's motivation helps set them apart as an antagonist. Showing the scale of their motivation helps demonstrate the kind of threat they pose. Antagonists can have more than one priority in the story, and it can be interesting where these conflict. 2. Secondly, finding the best motive to bring them into conflict with the protagonist is important. 2 ways to do this are having their motivation reflect but disagree with the protagonists, and having them share their motives in a way that draws them into conflict. 3. Thirdly, a more passively motivated antagonist tends to highlight the agency of the hero, while a more actively motivated antagonist can appear more imposing. 4. Fourthly, good guy antagonists can be more relatable for the reader, give a distinctly tragic undertone to the story, and allow the author to more easily develop theme. However, motivation is rarely ever as simple as the good or evil. 5. Fifthly, Save the World stories make it difficult to sustain climactic tension. One way to deal with this is by deriving tension from the fate of those characters or things involved instead. Part 6. Hero-villain relationships. Hogfather by Terry Pratchett, Fullmetal Alchemist by Hiromu Orokawa, The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan, and Jonathan Nolan, The Last of the Time Lords by Russell T. Davies, The Legend of Korra by Michael DiMartino, and Brian Konietzko, Artemis Fowl, The Opal Deception by Owen Colfer, The Dark Knight Returns by Alan Moore, The Waters of Mars by Russell T. Davies and Phil Ford, The Dark Tower series by Stephen King, The Sherlock Holmes stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, Arrow by Greg Berlanti, Mark Guggenheim, and Andrew Kreisberg, The Harry Potter series by J.A. Rowling, The Reichenbach Fall by Stephen Thompson, The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. When talking about the relationship between the protagonist and the antagonist, I am not referring to the romantic adventures of the Joker and Batman hidden in the deep fanfiction corners of the internet. No, the rivalry between your protagonist and your antagonist is inherently one of the driving elements of your story. We derive conflict and character change from it. But how does an author weave and develop this relationship into a good story? It is one thing to design a great protagonist and a fascinating antagonist, but it is another to write a story where those two individual characters work well within the same narrative. Susan Stu Hellett from Terry Pratchett's Hogfather is a fantastic protagonist, and likewise, Father from Oroko's Fullmetal Alchemist is an interesting antagonist, but there is a reason they are not placed within the same story. Neither the protagonist or antagonist exist in a vacuum. They exist in what John Truby in The Anatomy of Story calls the character web of people relating to one another. Susan only makes for a great protagonist, and Father only makes for a great antagonist, because of how they fit around the other characters in their respective character webs. Susan is the granddaughter of Death, ironically colder and less humorous, creating an interesting dynamic, and her role as a governess taking care of children puts her uniquely in the position to care that Mr. Teatime is using children's imaginations to kill the Hogfather. She grows to see the importance of imagination and childhood belief. Father is an absolutist in pursuit of the truth, wishing to manipulate life and death to become immortal, putting him in stark contrast to our two heroes, Edward and Alphonse, who attempted to do the same thing in bringing back their mother from the dead. His goal is given more meaning with reference to the experiences of other characters, even if the author isn't actively using this web to compare and contrast characters in their story. Readers certainly are, if unknowingly. We understand a character better by looking at the characters around them, how they relate, who they clash with, and how they do it, and very few relationships within this web are usually more important than the rivalry between the protagonist and the antagonist. It is through their struggle that the author can build dramatic tension, develop themes, and set up the stakes of the story as it unfolds. Because of this, a lot of good protagonist-antagonist relationships can come down to what we will call a necessity, that a great antagonist is necessary for the protagonist. It is simply not enough to say that they fought because plot. To put it in the simplest way possible, John Truby argues that the main opponent is the one person in the world best able to attack the great weakness of the hero. This forces the hero to overcome his weakness, or it destroys him. The necessary opponent makes it possible for the hero to grow. We will be discussing 3 different ways in which this necessity can manifest, structurally, ideologically, and through similarity. Structure. The first way to develop the rivalry is purely structural. The protagonist and antagonist have to want the same thing. This can be explicit like in J.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where the sides of good and evil are battling for control of Middle-earth, or it can be more abstract like in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. In that story, it may appear that Batman is fighting for order, and the Joker for chaos, but at its heart, the story is more nuanced than that. At the climax of the film, the Joker becomes the thematic mouthpiece in saying, "You don't think I'd lose the battle for the soul of Gotham in a fistfight with you, did you?" They are both fighting for the soul of Gotham. Active characters are ones who choose to change the direction of the story. Passive characters are ones who react to the direction of the story. Throughout The Dark Knight, Batman and the Joker have to react and plan against one another as they duke it out. Both are active players in building their rivalry. Having your heroes and opponents want the same thing immediately establishes the stakes early on, that by the end, only one side will stand. By making the rivals react and plan against one another as equally active characters, it means they are both decisive agents in the story, and the antagonist feels like more of a threat to the reader. The necessary opponent moment. But in structuring their rivalry, there needs to be a moment in the story where you as the author demonstrate that the necessary opponent is the person best designed to attack your protagonist. With this moment, not only does an author need the reader to understand this, but the protagonist needs to understand this too. However, it can come across as weak if this critical moment in the narrative is just that pithy throwaway line that we see in some Saturday morning cartoons. "By golly, my support character, this man is the greatest threat we have ever faced," just like last week's episode. One way to write this moment is to have your antagonist harm the protagonist in a way no other person has before, or perhaps even could. Only in the loss, pain, and consequences of that moment can the author articulate what sets this rival apart as the necessary opponent. There is a really interesting example of this in the Doctor Who episode The Last of the Time Lords by Russell T. Davies. A large part of the Doctor's character was that he had believed he was the last of his kind since the Time War. That was until he discovered that the Master survived as well. In the climax, the Doctor defeats the Master and takes him captive, but the Master gets shot by his mentally ill wife. Time Lords like the Master and the Doctor can regenerate, essentially meaning they can come back to life when dealt a fatal injury, but the Master stops himself from doing this. Doctor, there you go. I've got you. I've got you. Master, always the women. Doctor, I didn't see her. Master, dying in your arms. Happy now. Doctor, you're not dying. Don't be stupid. It's only a bullet. Just regenerate. Master, no. Doctor, one little bullet. Come on. Master, I guess you don't know me so well. I refuse. Doctor, regenerate. Just regenerate. Please. Please. Just regenerate. Come on. Master, and spend the rest of my life imprisoned with you. Doctor, you've got to. Come on. It can't end like this. You and me, all the things we've done. Axons. Remember the Axons. And the Daleks. We're the only two left. There's no one else. Regenerate. Master, how about that? I win. Will it stop, Doctor? The drumming. Will it stop? The Doctor was desperately clinging to the idea he was no longer the last of his species, and the Master was the only person in the universe who could take that from him in death. There are a couple of interesting ways you can use this moment in a story. 1. In the first season of The Legend of Korra, Amorn, the antagonist, devastated Korra, the protagonist, in a way nobody else ever could have. He took away the one thing she had defined herself by for much of her life, her bending abilities. This only happens in the final episode, and it was a threat that Korra feared for the whole season. 5. By placing the necessary opponent moment nearer the end of the story, a writer can build the dramatic tension around whether that moment will happen for the protagonist. It means that the protagonist might know that this antagonist can hurt them in a way nobody else can for a long time. 2. Alternatively, the necessary opponent moment can be placed nearer the beginning of the story. In Owen Colfer's Artemis Fowl, the Opal Deception, the antagonist kills Julius Root at the very beginning of the story, the one person Holly Short felt she could wholly depend on. This breaks her, and the rest of the story deals with Holly learning to stand on her own 2 feet without him. Placing this moment nearer the beginning of the story confronts the hero with the grave threat of their opponent, demands a darker tone, and often means the narrative is about dealing with the fallout of that horrific moment. Whether at the beginning or end, what is important to note is that to turn an antagonist into a necessary opponent, this moment must happen. In some cases, you may want the reader to understand the threat the protagonist faces, but not the protagonist themselves until much later, or perhaps too late. This is common in stories where the hero either underestimates the antagonist or doesn't know who the antagonist is until this moment. Logically, the moment would need to be placed towards the end as to keep the characters in the dark. However, divulging the capabilities and intentions of the antagonist to the reader by way of writing from their perspective, a prologue, or a flash-forward scene can create a tense experience of dramatic irony as the reader knows what their protagonist is heading for unawares, making the eventuality even more painful. Ideology. When building a rivalry, it is often more interesting when the conflict is not just physical, but ideological. Giving a character a unique set of beliefs and values helps with characterization, but as said, characters exist in a web, not a vacuum. While your hero might be a devout vegan Mormon, and your opponent a separatist other-kin communist, unless their 2 ideologies come into conflict during the story, they add little to narrative. My favorite example of this is in Alan Moore's The Dark Knight Returns. 6. The rivalry that evolves between Superman and Batman is not just the 2 physically battling it out for the sake of Gotham. Broadly speaking, it is an ideological battle between the individualist, Batman, acting on his own morals, and the collectivist, Superman, acting on behalf of the government. To fit with our previous point, if your hero and their opponent are both after the same thing, their ideological differences may contrast 2 different approaches to the same problem. By making the protagonist-antagonist rivalry ideological, the antagonist is better equipped to challenge their foe in a far more personal way. It goes to the core of their being, motivation, and philosophy. Not only does it integrate the main dramatic thread with theme, but it more easily allows for character development by forcing both the protagonist and antagonist to examine their values. 1. Which values do they stick to when challenged by the necessary opponent? 2. Which values do they bend, and where do they break? Normally, this kind of story culminates with the opponent's defeat and only the protagonist realizing something about themselves or their philosophy, but in reality, it is very rare that one side has it all right and the others are just pure evil. Because of this, one way to distinguish your story from this common pattern is with a double reversal where both the antagonist and protagonist have a realization at the end. After all, the antagonist is also being challenged ideologically. In the Doctor Who episode The Waters of Mars, the Doctor realizes he has become too controlling and gone too far, and Adelaide Brooke, who is not an antagonist but does oppose the Doctor, realizes she cannot go around changing time like she originally intended. The viewer comes to understand the moral vision of the story through the actions and realizations of both characters, not just the protagonist. A double reversal not only humanizes the antagonist by giving them a character arc, but it gives the ideological rivalry a more nuanced resolution. However, this does not mean your antagonist has to turn good. It is just as interesting to have them evolve but not switch allegiances. This is next to impossible, of course, if your opponent is never given a chance to do anything but eat puppies and consume the souls of orphans like your average Dark Lord. In Stephen King's magnum opus The Dark Tower series, the Crimson King lays claim to such titles as the Lord of Discordia, Satan, and the Antichrist. It would be a little unusual for him to suddenly turn around and give everyone hugs and a glass of warm milk. Antagonists like these are perfectly fine, but they cannot be so easily used for the purposes aforementioned. Similarity. A third way to build an interesting rivalry is with similarity between the two, though this point is often misunderstood. As established, characters do not exist in a vacuum but a web. Because of this, readers come to better understand your characters by comparing and contrasting them to other characters in the story. Where two characters exist in a contrast that highlights the differences between them, this is called a character foil, and it is about the oldest trope in the metaphorical literary books. In perhaps the most famous example of Arthur Conan Doyle's works, Sherlock Holmes' tendency to be rude or condescending highlights Watson's social skills, while Watson's more methodical approach highlights Holmes' impulsiveness. More often than not, a good rivalry will naturally evolve when the antagonist is the character foil of the protagonist and vice versa. However, the contrast between the two will be weak unless you also have strong similarities to make those differences stand out to the reader. Abilities. One way to write this dynamic is to give the antagonist and protagonist similar abilities. In Owen Colfer's Artemis Fowl series, both Artemis Fowl and Opal Cowboy are technological and science geniuses smart enough to manipulate those around them to their own ends. But their similarities here highlight their differences in values, as well as how Artemis Fowl has grown as a person since the first book. Personality or beliefs. In Berlanti, Guggenheim, and Kreisberg's Arrow series, Malcolm Merlyn and Oliver Queen are both morally utilitarian vigilantes with trouble building meaningful relationships and a strong sense of independence that lead them to do questionable things, right up to kidnapping and murder. Oliver Queen changes over the course of the series, but it is only through his rivalry with Malcolm Merlyn that he is forced to do so, making him the perfect foil. Backstories. In J.A. Rowling's Harry Potter series, both Harry and Voldemort were orphans. They were raised by Muggles, they felt like they did not belong, and they thought of Hogwarts as home more than anywhere else. These similarities highlight a key difference. While both started off feeling unloved, when Harry went to Hogwarts, he soon learned the power of friendship. This difference would genuinely change the course of the Second Wizarding War. The necessary antagonist is the one best equipped to attack your protagonist. Not only do similarities allow the opponent to better understand, predict, and thereby undermine the hero, but it narrows the dramatic focus in their rivalry to a limited number of differences that the reader can become more invested in. Taking similarity too far. However, there has been a tendency in recent times to take this similarity idea to an extreme, and to make the protagonist and antagonist alike in virtually every way possible except what is required to make one a hero, and the other a villain. And this can work well. There is something uniquely satisfying about the rivalry in Moffat and Gatiss' Sherlock series between Sherlock Holmes and Jim Moriarty. They dress the same, the actors look similar, they have similar, eccentric personalities. One calls themselves the consulting detective, while the other calls themselves the consulting criminal. The show is rife with scenes shot to parallel the two of them. This symmetry reads well and looks great, because who doesn't love literary symmetry? I will admit that I may be biased here, as I do have a bit of a fascination with literary symmetry that may not reflect its utility in writing. There is a reason comic books tends to do this all the time. Despite this, a high degree of symmetry is not required to design either necessary opponent or build an effective rivalry.